Marcus had always been a man of duty. For as long as he could remember, the royal family had been the center of his life, and he had given everything to serve them. He was a royal guard, part of an elite force tasked with the protection of the kingdom's most sacred places. Among those places was the hero's grave, a monument to a fallen soldier who had once saved the kingdom in a great war. The grave was a symbol of the kingdom's respect and gratitude, standing as a reminder of the sacrifices made to protect the realm. As a royal guard, Marcus was given the solemn responsibility of standing watch over this grave, guarding it day and night. It was an honor to him, and he took his job very seriously. The hero's grave was not just a memorial. It was the final resting place of someone who had given everything for the kingdom. To stand guard there was to honor that sacrifice. For Marcus, this place held special meaning. He had known the hero buried there, Captain Elias, a soldier who had once fought beside him. Years ago, they had been on the same battlefield, shoulder to shoulder, fighting for their kingdom's survival. Elias had been a mentor to Marcus, teaching him not only the ways of combat but also the deeper values of honor, loyalty, and leadership. Their bond had been forged in battle, and they had shared a mutual respect that ran deeper than words. Elias had shown Marcus what it meant to be a true leader, and Marcus had looked up to him as a figure of strength and wisdom. But the war had taken its toll, and in the final battle Elias had made the ultimate sacrifice. The loss had been devastating. Elias had fallen in the heat of battle, his life cut short just when victory was within reach. Marcus had been there when it happened, and the memory of that moment still haunted him. He had seen his mentor take his last breath, and the weight of that loss had stayed with him ever since. It was something Marcus had never truly been able to shake off. In the years that followed, Marcus had thrown himself into his duties as a royal guard. He kept busy, keeping his emotions in check, believing that duty was the only thing that could help him move forward. But there was always a part of him that felt empty. Elias's death had left a hole in his heart, and no matter how much time passed, that hole never quite healed. Every day, Marcus stood at the hero's grave, his posture straight and his eyes fixed on the ground in front of him. He had become a fixture at the grave, his presence almost as constant as the monument itself. The visitors to the grave would often remark on how dedicated he was, how steadfast he stood day after day. But few knew the pain he carried with him, the silent grief that weighed on his shoulders. In the quiet moments when no one was around, Marcus would sometimes allow himself to remember Elias. He would recall the sound of his mentor's voice, the way Elias had always known just what to say in times of uncertainty. He would think about the jokes they had shared, the stories they had exchanged during their long hours of training. The memories were bittersweet. On the one hand, they brought him comfort, but on the other, they only reminded him of the loss he had endured. It was a constant tug of war between holding on to the past and trying to move forward. The hero's grave had become a place of solitude for Marcus, but it was also a place of struggle. Every day he stood there holding his post, and every day the same thoughts would drift into his mind. Did Elias's death mean something? Was Marcus living a life worthy of the sacrifices made by those who had fought for the kingdom? It was on one of those days, as the sun was beginning to set and the graveyard grew quiet, that Marcus felt a strange shift within himself. It was subtle at first, just a quiet stirring in his chest, but as the minutes passed, the feeling grew stronger, a sense of unease slowly bubbling up from deep inside him. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt as though he couldn't stand the weight of the silence anymore. It wasn't the usual stillness he had become so accustomed to. This felt different, unsettling, almost suffocating. He shifted his stance slightly, trying to shake off the sensation. But the more he tried to focus, the more the feeling pressed in on him. It was as though the weight of the past, of Elias's death, was suddenly too much to bear. Marcus felt a tightening in his chest, his breaths becoming shallow. He had always prided himself on his strength, on his ability to maintain control. But today something felt off. The emotional walls he had carefully constructed over the years were beginning to crumble, and he had no idea how to stop it. As the sun dipped lower behind the horizon, the shadows around the graveyard grew longer. Marcus stood there, his hands trembling slightly at his sides, his gaze drifting to the gravestone that marked Elias's final resting place. The cold wind blew through the trees, but it wasn't the chill in the air that made him shiver. It was the growing storm inside him. It was as if the grief, The guilt, the anger, and the sadness he had buried for so long were finally rising to the surface. He had always been taught that a royal guard was supposed to be unmoving, unshakable. His duty was to protect, to serve, and to never falter. But standing there now in the quiet of the evening, Marcus couldn't hold it all in anymore. The weight of his emotions, of the loss of his mentor, of his own struggles to move forward, became too much for him to carry. He felt himself collapse inwardly, like a dam that had finally burst. It started with a single tear, the first one he had allowed himself to shed in years. It ran down his cheek, and for the briefest of moments Marcus felt a sense of relief. But then the floodgates opened. His hands gripped the sides of the grave as he fought to hold himself together. The sobs came uncontrollable, and Marcus couldn't stop them. His shoulders shook with the force of his grief, and he fell to his knees beside the grave, unable to keep himself upright any longer. For the first time since Elias's death, Marcus allowed himself to grieve fully. He wept for his lost mentor, for the loss of their shared future, and for the man he had never truly been able to be in the face of such a tragedy. The weight of his failure, the feeling that he had not lived up to the example Elias had set, crushed him. He had promised his mentor he would carry on the legacy of their fight, but now, standing here at the grave, he wasn't sure he had done that. The tears flowed freely now, and Marcus could no longer distinguish the line between grief and guilt. It was all mixed together in a painful, overwhelming rush. The duty he had clung to for so long suddenly felt like a burden he could no longer bear. The man who had always stood firm, always in control, was now lost in his emotions, kneeling in the shadows of the hero's grave. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, Marcus was left alone with his sorrow, feeling as though the very weight of the past had brought him to his knees. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. The royal guard, the soldier who had never shown weakness, had finally allowed himself to break. As Marcus knelt beside the hero's grave, the world around him seemed to fall away. The wind no longer whispered through the trees. The sounds of the kingdom faded into nothing. All he could hear was the rushing of blood in his ears, the pounding of his heart, and his own ragged breath as it fought to draw in air. His body trembled not from the cold, but from the storm of emotions inside him. Every sob that escaped his chest seemed to tear him apart further, but at the same time, it was a relief, a release he didn't realize he needed until now. It had been so long since he had allowed himself to feel anything. For years, Marcus had buried his grief beneath the armor of duty. As a royal guard, he was trained to be unshakable. There was no room for weakness, no time for personal sorrow. His responsibility was to protect, to serve, and to stand unwavering in the face of anything that might threaten the kingdom or the royal family. His life was one of discipline, structure, and stoic resolve. But in that moment, all of it shattered. The grief that had been building inside him for so many years came crashing down. He had kept it locked away, telling himself that if he kept moving forward, if he just focused on his duties, it would all somehow fade away. But it hadn't. It had been festering, quietly taking root in his heart, growing heavier with each passing year. Now there was no more hiding from it. For the first time in a long time, Marcus allowed himself to remember Elias, not as the hero celebrated by the kingdom, but as the man he had known. Elias was not just a legend. He was a mentor, a friend, a brother in arms. Marcus could still hear his voice clear as day, offering words of wisdom, encouragement, and sometimes even humor. He remembered the way Elias had always known when Marcus needed advice, and how he had made him laugh even when the world seemed like it was falling apart around them. But that was before. Before the final battle, before Elias had sacrificed himself to ensure the kingdom's survival. The memory of that day came rushing back, and Marcus couldn't stop it. He saw Elias standing at the front of the battle line, rallying the troops, leading them with such courage and conviction that it was impossible not to follow him. Elias had been their captain, their leader, and he had been the one who kept them going when everything seemed lost. But when the battle had reached its peak, when victory was within reach, Elias had made the ultimate choice. He had given his life to protect them all. Marcus had been there. He had seen it all. He had watched as Elias took the final blow, falling in the heat of battle, his life snuffed out in an instant. The sight of his mentor, so full of life just moments before, now lying lifeless in the dirt, had been too much for Marcus to bear. He had rushed to Elias's side, calling out to him, but it was too late. The war was over. But the loss was only beginning. Marcus had never fully recovered from that day. The guilt, the sense of helplessness, it had stayed with him, a constant weight on his soul. He had told himself over and over that there was nothing he could have done. He had tried to convince himself that Elias had made the choice he had, because it was the right one, the only one that would ensure the safety of the kingdom. But no matter how many times he said those words, they never seemed to ease the pain. He had lost his mentor, his friend, and he had never truly forgiven himself for it. As the tears continued to fall, Marcus couldn't help but wonder if he had done enough. Had he honored Elias's memory in the way he should have? Had he lived up to the ideals Elias had instilled in him? Or had he too failed? His thoughts swirled in a chaotic mess, each question digging deeper into the wound that had never healed. The night seemed to grow darker around him, and Marcus felt as though he was sinking into the depths of his own grief. The grave before him felt like a heavy weight pressing down on him, and he could no longer find the strength to stand. He remained kneeling in the dirt, his hands gripping the sides of the gravestone as though it was the only thing holding him together. His mind raced with memories, and his heart ached with longing for a time before the war, before Elias's death, when everything had seemed so much simpler. It was then that he heard it. At first, it was faint, a rustling sound in the wind. Marcus barely noticed it, too lost in his own thoughts to pay it any mind. But then the sound grew louder, closer. It was as if someone or something was moving toward him. His body tensed instinctively, his guard training kicking in. But as he turned to look, he saw nothing. The graveyard was still, the shadows stretching across the ground as the moonlight bathed the area in an eerie glow. Marcus glanced around, trying to shake off the feeling that he wasn't alone. But everything seemed normal, too normal. The wind continued to blow softly through the trees and the night remained silent, save for the distant sounds of the kingdom that could hardly be heard from where he was. And then, he saw it. A figure appeared at the edge of his vision, standing just beyond the shadows of the trees. At first, Marcus thought it was just another trick of the light or his own tired mind playing tricks on him. But the figure didn't move. It stood there, unmoving, watching him. Something in the stillness of the moment made Marcus feel as though this presence was not of this world. He wasn't sure if it was real, but a cold shiver ran down his spine. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the figure. The shape seemed familiar, but he couldn't place it. There was something about the way it stood, the way it seemed to be both part of the shadows and yet somehow apart from them. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment all he could do was stare, frozen in place. Slowly, almost hesitantly, the figure took a step forward. The sound of its footsteps was soft, almost inaudible, yet it echoed in Marcus's ears. The figure's movements were graceful, but there was something unsettling about it, something that made Marcus's instincts flare. As the figure drew closer, Marcus's mind began to race. Who was this? A visitor? A ghost? His thoughts spun in circles, but he couldn't take his eyes off the figure, unable to look away no matter how much he tried to calm his mind. It was then that the figure spoke. The voice was low, but it was unmistakable. It was Elias's voice. The sound of it almost knocked the wind out of Marcus's lungs. For a moment he was sure he had gone mad. Was this real? Had the grief finally broken him? "Marcus," the voice whispered, soft and soothing, yet filled with a strength Marcus recognized all too well. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His throat was tight, constricted by the emotions flooding through him. He could only stare at the figure as it stepped closer, its form beginning to shift with the mist that surrounded it. The figure seemed to fade in and out of existence like a shadow that couldn't decide where to settle. Marcus's heart pounded harder in his chest. What was happening? Was he hallucinating? Had the weight of his grief finally consumed him? The figure moved closer still, and with every step Marcus felt a strange sense of calm, a deep comfort that began to replace his panic. Maybe this wasn't a ghost. Maybe it was something else, something that he needed to see, something he needed to hear. Marcus's heart raced in his chest as the figure in front of him began to take shape, growing clearer in the dim light of the graveyard. His breath was shallow, his hand still gripping the gravestone as though it was the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. The voice that had spoken was unmistakable. It was Elias's voice, the very same tone and timbre Marcus had heard countless times in the past. Yet this was impossible. Elias was gone. He had watched him fall in battle all those years ago. The figure moved closer and Marcus could see it more clearly now. A tall, shadowed silhouette. It wore the familiar armor of a soldier, the same kind that Elias had worn, shining faintly in the moonlight. The cloak that hung from the figure's shoulder swirled in the breeze, and for a brief moment, Marcus could have sworn he saw the outline of Elias's face beneath the hood. But it was only for a fleeting moment, and the figure was gone again, blending with the shadows that surrounded them. The silence hung thick in the air. Marcus tried to speak, to ask if he was dreaming or if he had finally lost his mind, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he possibly make sense of what he was seeing? Was this an illusion? A trick of the mind brought on by years of pent-up grief? But before he could gather his thoughts, the figure spoke again, its voice as calm and steady as he remembered Elias's voice to be. Marcus. The voice called softer this time, almost as if it were reaching out to him across a great distance. You've carried too much for too long. The words struck deep, like a weight lifted from his chest. Marcus could feel the pressure of years of grief, guilt, and regret. All those years of trying to hold everything together, suddenly easing just a little. The burden that had weighed him down for so long, he could feel it lifting in small increments, just by hearing Elias's voice again. Despite the confusion and fear swirling within him, Marcus found himself speaking, his voice rough from the tears he had shed moments ago. Elias, is it really you? The words barely escaped his lips, almost a whisper, and he was unsure whether he even believed them himself. The figure stood still, then nodded slowly. It is, Marcus, but not in the way you think. The voice was familiar, comforting, and yet there was something strange about it, something distant that Marcus couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the ghost of his mentor. It was something more, something he had never considered. Marcus's mind raced with questions. He wanted to ask so many things, how this was possible, what it meant, why now after all these years, but he couldn't find the right words. He had to know one thing above all else, the thing that had plagued him ever since the moment he had watched Elias fall in the battle. Why did you have to die? But before he could voice his question, the figure took another step forward, its presence more solid now, like it was no longer a wisp of smoke, but a real being standing in front of him. You've been carrying my death, Marcus. You've been holding on to it, trying to make sense of something that doesn't need to make sense. You need to let go. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. Let go? How could he? Elias had been his mentor, his friend. He had been the person who had taught him everything, about life, about duty, about what it meant to protect those you loved. Elias's death had left a hole in Marcus's heart that he could never seem to fill, no matter how many years passed. He hadn't known how to move on without him. I don't understand, Marcus whispered, his voice shaky. I promised I would honor you, that I would carry on your legacy, but I've failed. I can't move past it. Every day it's like I'm just standing still, guarding your grave, trying to hold on to something that's gone. The figure's head tilted slightly, almost as if it were considering his words before responding. You haven't failed, Marcus. You've done more than I could have asked for. You've lived with honor, with courage, and you've carried my memory with you all these years. But you cannot live in the past forever. You need to live for today, for the future. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. But how? How can I move on when you're gone? How can I just forget? The figure's voice softened, almost comforting. You don't have to forget me. You don't have to forget what we fought for. But you need to let go of the pain, the guilt that's holding you back. Honor me. Honor our memory by living a life that reflects what we fought for. You can't do that if you're trapped in the past. The words struck Marcus like a thunderclap, sudden and intense. He felt something inside him shift, like a long-buried seed had begun to sprout in his chest. All these years he had been holding on so tightly to his grief, thinking that if he just didn't let go, it would somehow keep Elias alive in some way. But now, standing before the figure of his mentor, his ghost or whatever it was, he realized that he had been wrong. He had been holding on so tightly to the past that he had forgotten how to truly live in the present. Marcus felt a pang in his chest, a bittersweet ache. But I don't know how to do that, he said quietly. I've spent so long protecting others, doing my duty. How do I live for myself? The figure took a step closer, its presence almost overwhelming now. Living for yourself doesn't mean abandoning your duty. It means giving yourself permission to feel, to grieve, and to grow. You've been strong for so long, Marcus, but you don't have to be strong all the time. It's okay to hurt. It's okay to let go. And it's okay to start living again. Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes once more, but this time they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, of understanding. He had been so focused on duty and honor, on protecting others and keeping his emotions buried, that he had never allowed himself to truly heal. For all these years he had thought that by standing guard at the hero's grave, by keeping Elias's memory alive, he was honoring his mentor. But now he understood. Elias wanted him to move on, to live for the future. The figure smiled, and though Marcus couldn't see the details of its face clearly, he could feel the warmth in its expression. You've done enough, Marcus. It's time to let go. It's time to live your life. As the figure began to fade, disappearing back into the shadows of the graveyard, Marcus felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over him. He stood there still and silent, watching as the last remnants of the figure melted into the night. The wind blew softly around him, and for the first time in years, Marcus felt like the weight on his shoulders had lightened. The burden he had carried for so long was no longer suffocating him. He was not free of his memories of Elias, but he was free from the guilt, the grief, and the fear of moving on. Elias had given him a gift, an understanding that it was okay to live, to let go, and to honor the past by living for the future. With that, Marcus took a deep breath and stood tall. He wasn't alone anymore. Elias would always be with him, in the lessons he had taught, in the memories they had shared, and in the way Marcus would continue to live. The night was still, the stars above shining brightly. It was time to walk forward with honor, with strength, and with peace.